a run-down apartment. A young black boy, Jaden, 12, sits on his bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. Another night with no dinner. Another day wondering if life will ever get better. If you could change a child's life forever, would you? Jaden's life wasn't easy. Every day he woke up early, long before the sun rose, to a world that barely noticed him. The smell of stale cereal filled the small, one-bedroom apartment, a stark contrast to the warmth of the mornings he imagined in his dreams. His grandmother, a small but tough woman, worked as a housekeeper for the wealthiest families in the neighborhood, coming home late every night, exhausted, but determined to make sure Jaden had what he needed, though it was never enough. They were never enough. Jaden had no father to look up to, no mother to call, just the quiet, steady presence of his grandmother who told him every day, "You're gonna be someone one day. Don't forget it." But for Jaden, those words felt like a promise he couldn't keep. How could he dream when survival was all that mattered? How could he aspire for anything more when every night he went to bed hungry, his stomach growling louder than his ambition? His shoes were scuffed, barely held together by worn laces. His pants, too big and patched, hung low on his small frame. But it didn't matter. As long as he kept moving, as long as he kept working, he could forget the ache of his feet. Forget the way the kids at school ignored him, their laughter drowning out the quiet sound of his heart, hoping for something better. Every morning, Jaden collected cans from the alleyways, earning a few cents here and there. He'd also sweep the local convenience store's floor, deliver groceries to neighbors, and run errands for the elderly who couldn't get out of their houses. He had mastered the art of blending in, of working quietly and unnoticed. It was a life of service. No one noticed how hard he worked, but that was okay. He didn't need to be seen. He just needed to keep going, keep helping, and keep the roof over their heads for one more day. In school, Jaden's teachers spoke to him as if he were invisible. They offered sympathy in passing, but none of them truly understood the weight he carried, the fear in his heart that one day his grandmother would be too tired to work, or worse, too sick to get up at all. While the other kids daydreamed about vacations and new toys, Jaden's only dream was survival. He wanted his grandmother to have one night where she could rest without worrying about bills. The other kids made fun of him sometimes, but he didn't mind. Their taunts barely made a sound in his ears. The real pain came when he'd see them playing, laughing with their parents, family so complete while his own seemed so broken. No father, no mother, just him and his grandmother, struggling but surviving. But even in a life so filled with hardship, Jaden's heart refused to give up on hope. He still dreamed of a future. Maybe not a fancy one. Maybe not the kind of life where he'd have the newest shoes or clothes, but one where he didn't have to worry if tomorrow would be any different from today. Where his grandmother didn't have to choose between paying the rent or buying food. In the back of his mind, Jaden dreamed of being someone who could make a difference, even if no one could see him. But for now, he held on to what little he had, made sure his grandmother was fed, and kept working, one small job at a time. Wherever you are watching from, and whatever time it is, take a moment to think about the strength it takes to keep going, even when the odds are against you. Would you have the courage to dream under circumstances like Jaden's? What keeps you moving forward in tough times? Drop a comment below. Jaden had been cleaning floors for hours, his hands raw from the constant scrubbing. The glistening marble beneath his feet seemed to mock him as he moved across the vast shopping mall, surrounded by luxury, designer brands, and the hum of carefree conversations. To them, he was just another invisible worker, nothing more than a backdrop to the extravagant displays. The mothers with their shopping bags, the children running through the stores with toys, none of them ever looked at him. He didn't exist to them, just the quiet presence that kept their world sparkling clean. Today was no different. Jaden kept his head down, pushing the mop across the floor, barely noticing the people around him. His mind wasn't on the shoppers or the luxuries around him. It was on the small apartment he shared with his grandmother, the only person who truly cared for him. Every day was the same routine: wake up, work, and go to bed. There was no time for dreaming, not when survival was the priority. But then a sound pierced through the background noise, a baby's cry. Jaden stopped mid-mop and looked up. A woman, clearly well off, was distracted by her phone near the escalator. Her attention was completely consumed by the screen, unaware of the stroller sitting dangerously close to the edge. Jaden watched in slow motion as the stroller tipped over, the wheels spinning wildly. Before anyone could react, the baby inside the stroller was thrown forward, tumbling onto the moving escalator. The woman screamed, her voice cutting through the silence. Jaden's heart raced, and everything seemed to freeze for a second. People around him stood motionless, paralyzed by the shock of what was happening. The baby, helpless and small, rolled closer to the moving steps, completely unaware of the danger that was about to swallow it whole. Without thinking, Jaden acted. Jaden's heart raced as he sprinted toward the moving escalator. The sound of his own breath was loud in his ears, drowning out everything else. His eyes were locked on the stroller, teetering dangerously close to the edge, the baby inside unaware of the impending disaster. The woman, completely absorbed in her phone, hadn't noticed the stroller inching its way closer to the abyss. The seconds stretched out like hours as Jaden's feet pounded against the polished floor. The baby in the stroller tumbled forward, falling onto the escalator, its tiny body moving closer and closer to the edge. The sharp cry from the mother snapped him out of his trance. His adrenaline surged. He didn't think. He just reacted. Without even hesitating, he threw himself onto the escalator. His hands reached out, his fingers barely grazing the baby's blanket as he slid down the steps, the force of his body hitting the steps with a loud smack. His stomach lurched as he realized how close the fall had been. The baby was inches from disaster. His arms wrapped tightly around the child, pulling them into his chest with all his strength. He felt the baby's fragile body against his, the soft cries mixing with the sound of the escalator as it continued to move. His body slammed against the escalator steps, a sharp pain shooting through his shoulder, but Jaden didn't care. His only thought was keeping the baby safe. The world around him seemed to pause. The frantic movement of the escalator, the blur of people around him, all faded into the background as he focused on one thing: the baby in his arms. He held the tiny life close to his chest, trying to shield it from the danger. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed behind him. The mall security guards arrived, rushing over with panic written across their faces. Jaden's breath was ragged, his muscles aching, but he didn't let go of the baby. He had done it. He had saved them. The woman, now hysterical, ran toward him. Her voice cracked with emotion as she fell to her knees beside him, reaching out to her child. "Oh, my God! You saved my baby!" Her voice was trembling with gratitude. She looked at Jaden, tears streaming down her face. The baby, now safely in his arms, began to quiet down, its small body still in shock, but no longer in danger. Jaden's arms were shaking as he held the baby. The adrenaline was still coursing through him, making his hands feel numb, but he didn't care. He had done what no one else would have. He had acted when it counted the most. The security guards stepped forward speaking to the woman, but Jaden was lost in the moment. His heart was still racing, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality of what had just happened. The woman turned to him, still crying, her voice full of emotion. "I don't know what to say. Thank you. You saved my baby's life." Jaden didn't know what to say either. He hadn't expected anything. He hadn't done it for a reward. He had just done what felt right in that moment. But hearing her words made him feel like something had changed inside him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel invisible. He had been noticed. As the security guards stepped in, taking the baby from his arms, the woman placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're a hero," she said softly. Her eyes were filled with appreciation, something Jaden wasn't used to receiving. He blinked, overwhelmed by the intensity of it all. His thoughts were a whirlwind, the shock of the moment finally starting to settle in. His legs wobbled, and he stumbled slightly. It was as if the weight of the world was suddenly crushing down on him. He'd saved a life. And in doing so, he had proven something to himself. He wasn't just a kid from the streets. He wasn't just someone who lived in the background. He mattered. The mother held her baby close to her chest as she looked back at Jaden, her eyes soft. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice shaking with emotion. Jaden nodded slowly, unsure of what to say but feeling the weight of the moment. The room around him seemed to stand still as people began to murmur, some applauding, others simply watching with awe. He had done the right thing. As the security guards began to escort the woman and her baby away, Jaden turned slowly, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had acted without thinking, and in doing so, had saved a life. And for the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Would you have been brave enough to jump? What would you have done in Jaden's shoes? Let us know in the comments. The commotion around Jaden fades as he stands there, still processing the events. The baby is safe, the danger past, and paramedics have taken over the scene. He watches as people move around, the once panic-stricken crowd now in hushed awe. But then, Jaden feels a sudden shift in the atmosphere. A sleek, black luxury car rolls up outside the mall, and the crowd parts like the Red Sea. Jaden watches in confusion as a tall, sharply dressed man steps out, his presence demanding attention. He's followed by a woman with tear-streaked cheeks, holding her baby close. This is Christopher Langston, the CEO, the man with the wealth to buy the world, and the power to make it stop for him. The woman whispers something to him, pointing toward Jaden. He sees the billionaire's gaze snap toward him, studying him from head to toe. For a moment, Jaden feels out of place, standing in his worn-out shoes and second-hand clothes amidst the glitz and glamour of the mall. The mother, still visibly shaken, hurries over to Jaden and speaks with gratitude, her voice barely above a whisper. "That boy saved our son's life." Jaden shrugs awkwardly, unsure of what to do. He doesn't seek praise, doesn't expect any. "I just did what I had to," he says, feeling the weight of attention suddenly fall on him. It's overwhelming, yet strangely exhilarating. Langston approaches, his face unreadable. The crowd falls silent, sensing the tension. "You're the boy who saved my son?" Langston asks, his voice calm yet sharp. Jaden nods, his throat dry. "Yes, sir." The billionaire looks him up and down once more. his sharp eyes scanning every detail. Jaden feels small under that gaze. He's used to people looking through him, ignoring him, but this is different. This man, this billionaire, seems to be studying him in a way that makes Jaden uncomfortable. Langston stands there for a long moment as if deciding something. Then his lips curve into a slight smile, though it's hard to read his intentions. "Come to my house tomorrow," he says, his voice commanding. Jaden's heart skips a beat. Did he hear that right? He blinks, unsure of how to respond. A part of him wants to refuse. He knows his place. He knows who he is, and people like Langston don't just offer help without strings attached. But another part of him, his curiosity, his longing for something more, pushes him to answer differently. Jaden stands there for a moment, the words hanging in the air. What does he even say to a billionaire? How could he even belong in the world of people like this? The crowd watches, waiting for Jaden's reaction, but all he can do is stare up at the man who could change his life with a single offer. Langston waits, his expression unreadable, but his eyes seem to soften slightly as he adds, "It's just a conversation. You saved my son's life, and I think it's time we talked." Jaden stands still, lost in the enormity of the moment. What could someone like him possibly have to offer to a billionaire? What does Langston see in him? With a deep breath, Jaden slowly nods. "Okay," he says quietly, a bit unsure. "I'll be there." As he turns to leave, the eyes of them all follow him. For the first time in a long while, Jaden feels like he's more than just a kid from the streets. Maybe, just maybe, his life is about to change in ways he never would have imagined. What would you do if a billionaire invited you into his life? Share your thoughts below. The mansion stood in front of Jaden, towering and intimidating. Golden gates, lush gardens, marble pillars, things he had only seen in movies. His heart raced as he stood at the entrance, unsure of what was happening or why he was even here. His clothes felt too shabby for this world. His shoes, worn and beaten, were in sharp contrast to the polished marble floors that lay ahead. The butler, a stern-looking man in a suit, opened the door and gave him a slight nod. "Mr. Langston is expecting you," he said, his voice calm but commanding. Jaden hesitated, his feet frozen to the ground for a moment. Why was he here? He had never set foot in a place like this before. His world was small, an apartment he shared with his grandmother, a world of hand-me-downs and struggling to make ends meet. This place was a dream, a fantasy, a world that felt like it could swallow him whole. But the butler didn't wait. He stepped aside and motioned for Jaden to come in. Jaden stepped through the door, his legs shaking, feeling completely out of place in the pristine marble entryway. He could hear faint laughter and the clinking of glasses from deeper inside. The air smelled like fresh flowers, a stark contrast to the street odors he was used to. The man who entered the room was nothing like the people Jaden had seen walking through the mall. He was tall, in his 50s, wearing a tailored suit that looked as if it was made from the finest fabric. This was Mr. Langston, rich, successful, and somehow the person who had come to change Jaden's life forever. "Jaden," Mr. Langston greeted him warmly, his deep voice rich with authority, but there was an odd softness to it. "I wanted to thank you for what you did for my son. You didn't just save him, Jaden. You saved my family." Jaden shifted uncomfortably, still processing the events of the day before. He hadn't thought twice when the baby had rolled off the escalator. He had just acted. But now, standing in front of this stranger, his own heart racing as he tried to comprehend the situation, he felt small again. Mr. Langston handed him a large envelope. Jaden stared at it, unsure. His fingers brushed the edge of the envelope, but he didn't reach for it. "You don't have to do anything, Mr. Langston," Jaden said, trying to find his voice. "I only did what anyone would have done." Mr. Langston smiled gently. "What you did was special, and now I want to return the favor." He stepped closer, guiding Jaden's hand to the envelope. "Go ahead, open it." With a hesitant breath, Jaden carefully tore open the envelope, pulling out a piece of paper. His eyes scanned the words. A deed. It took a moment for his brain to process what it was. A deed to a house. He looked up at Mr. Langston, his mouth going dry. This can't be mine," he stammered. I don't deserve this." Mr. Langston's gaze softened. "Yes, you do. You saved my son's life, and now I want to give you something in return. This is a home. For you and your grandmother." Jaden felt his hands tremble as he looked at the document again. The address listed on the deed was for a mansion, a home bigger than anything he had ever imagined. A place where he could finally escape the cold, the hunger, and the fear of living in the shadows. But he couldn't believe it. Not really. He looked up at Mr. Langston, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to say. This is too much." Langston's smile never wavered. "It's not too much. It's exactly what you deserve. Don't let your past define your future, Jaden. You have a chance now. Take it." Jaden could hardly hold back the tears that welled up in his eyes. He had never dreamed of something like this. A home. A real home. Not an apartment with peeling paint and broken windows. A place where he and his grandmother could finally breathe. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He had always taken care of others, always done what he could to help his grandmother survive. But this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. Mr. Langston patted him on the back gently. "Don't worry, Jaden. You've earned it. Now it's time to live." Jaden finally smiled, the weight on his shoulders lifting just a little. For the first time in his life, he could imagine a future. "Thank you," he whispered. Mr. Langston smiled back, his eyes full of understanding. "You're welcome." Jaden didn't know what would come next. He didn't know what the future held. But one thing was clear. He had a chance. A real chance. And for the first time, it was his to take. A week later, Jaden and his grandmother stood in the doorway of their new home, a place they could finally call their own. The small apartment they had lived in for so long had been dark and cramped, with leaking roofs and constant worry about rent. But now there was light, there was space, there was hope. Jaden's grandmother, her face worn from years of hardship, took a deep breath as she stepped into the living room. She looked around, her eyes welling with tears. "We made it, Jaden," she said softly, as she wrapped her arms around him. "We finally made it." Jaden didn't respond immediately. His mind was still spinning from the events of the past week. From the mall, to the baby on the escalator, to the strangers who had stepped in to help. His life, their lives, had been changed in the blink of an eye. He had never expected any of this. All he had wanted to do was help, just as he always had, taking care of his grandmother, working odd jobs to make ends meet. He had never thought about what might come from it. But now he had a new home, a new life, and a sense of stability he had never known before. Standing in his new bedroom, he looked out the window, watching the city go by. He didn't feel invisible anymore. He wasn't the boy nobody noticed. Now he had a place in this world. He had been seen. He glanced down at the small, worn-out shoes on his feet, the same ones that had carried him through so many days of hardship. They weren't falling apart anymore, but they still reminded him of the struggle. And that's when it hit him. It wasn't just about the new house or the opportunities that had opened up. It was the fact that his life, his world, had changed because he had taken action. He hadn't waited for someone to step in. He had done something, even when he didn't know how things would turn out. "I was just trying to help," Jaden whispered to himself, a soft smile tugging at his lips. His heart swelled with a feeling he had never really known before. Hope. It was a feeling that was beginning to bloom in the cracks of his past struggles, filling the empty spaces with something new. But as he stood there, looking out at the city, Jaden understood something more. Sometimes, doing the right thing, no matter how small, could lead to something far bigger than you ever imagined. Helping that baby had led to a miracle for him and his grandmother. It had led to new doors opening, to opportunities they could have only dreamed of. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the city, Jaden turned back to face the room. He still had a lot to learn, a lot to figure out. But for the first time, he wasn't alone. He wasn't invisible. And that made all the difference. "We're gonna be okay, Grandma," he said, looking up at his grandmother, who stood in the doorway with a smile on her face. "We're gonna be more than okay." And in that moment, they both knew everything had changed. It wasn't just about the house. It was about the future. It was about hope. And it had all started with a boy who had simply wanted to help. But sometimes helping leads to miracles.